The film reel crackles. A voice begins to narrate over images in black and white, skeletal prisoners, snow falling over barbed wire, and chimneys releasing columns of ash into a sky that has forgotten the color blue. It is January 1944. The war has turned, but in the heart of Poland, time seems frozen inside the fences of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Here, men no longer resemble men, and the air itself tastes of burnt flesh and disinfectant. The camp operates like a machine, precise, obedient, unfeeling. In this world of mud and smoke walks SS Unterscharführer Heinrich Adler, a man whose uniform gleams even under the grey sky. His boots crush the snow as if he were erasing the last traces of humanity beneath them. Prisoners whisper his name only in secret, Adler, the dog. He has no rank in their eyes, only fear. Every night, after the roll calls and gunshots fade into silence, his shadow crosses the threshold of the women's barracks. He moves slowly, methodically, choosing without pattern, as if guided by instinct. Some nights he takes one woman, other nights, two. No one ever sees them again in the same way. The commandant knows, the guards know, but no one speaks. The silence of the camp is part of its design. It is the sound of control. Among the thousands marked by numbers on their arms is Leah Weiss, a 23-year-old Jewish nurse from Krakow. Her hands once treated the wounded. Now they shake as she folds rags inside a barrack, colder than the night outside. Unlike many others, she still has something dangerous in her eyes, a flicker that refuses to die. When Heinrich's gaze finds hers for the first time, it is not by accident. There is something about defiance that draws predators, something that promises resistance and therefore pleasure. Outside, the chimneys continue to breathe their endless smoke. Inside, the prisoners whisper prayers that never reach the sky. And in the center of this frozen world, an unthinkable encounter is about to begin. One that will turn the predator into prey and etch its memory into the forbidden archives of the Reich. The first signs that something had shifted inside Auschwitz were almost invisible, like cracks forming beneath a frozen lake. Daily routines persisted with mechanical precision, the sirens at dawn, the shuffling of prisoners forced into lines, the barking of orders through frigid air. But the atmosphere carried an odd dissonance, a tension humming beneath the monotony of suffering. And at the center of this tension was Leah Weiss, whose silence, once mistaken for fear, now concealed an emerging force that few noticed and none understood. For weeks, Heinrich Adler's visits to the women's barrack had become a predictable terror. The creak of the wooden door, the rhythmic thud of polished boots, the metallic jangle of keys, all of it formed a ritual of dread. Yet those who watched Leah after her encounters sensed something uncanny. She did not collapse into the hollow despair that consumed so many. Instead, she grew stiller, colder, more deliberate. Her eyes lingered on things others avoided: the guard towers, the patterns of patrols, the clumsy arguments between SS soldiers drunk on stolen liquor. She observed with the precision of someone taking mental notes, assembling fragments into something approaching a plan. This quiet defiance unsettled the few who remained lucid enough to perceive it. Miriam, an older prisoner who slept beside Leah, whispered warnings whenever Leah seemed too bold in her observations. She had survived long enough to recognize the danger of even a flicker of rebellion. "They watch everything," she murmured one night as Leah stared through a crack in the barrack wall, following Heinrich's silhouette as he crossed the yard. "If you keep looking at them like that, they will crush what is left of you." But Leah didn't answer. She simply continued watching until the cold air numbed her breathing. Her resistance did not take shape as open confrontation. That would have been suicide. Instead, it emerged in subtle gestures, small enough to escape official scrutiny, but sharp enough to capture the unease of those around her. At roll call, she no longer bowed her head as deeply. When guards shouted, she did not flinch as violently as the others. And most disquieting of all, she began studying Heinrich Adler himself. She memorized the way he handled his keys, the exact pocket where he tucked his lighter, the moments he grew careless after drinking. She even noted the slight tremor in his hand, a detail that suggested not weakness, but the beginnings of overconfidence. The first real disturbance came on a night when the snow fell in heavy sheets, muffling sound and turning the camp into a world of pale shadows. Heinrich entered the women's barrack later than usual, his steps uneven from alcohol. He scanned the rows of faces with an odd impatience, as if irritated by something he could not name. When his eyes landed on Leah, she did not react with the customary terror he enjoyed eliciting. Instead, she lifted her gaze and held his stare for 2 full seconds, an eternity in a place where eye contact could mean death. Something inside him recoiled, though he would never admit it. He barked her number sharply, harsher than necessary, as if trying to reassert authority that he suddenly felt slipping. As she walked past him, there was no trembling in her steps. To the other prisoners, it looked like madness. To Heinrich, though he refused to reflect on it, it felt like challenge. When Leah returned hours later, the women saw no bruises, no outward signs of the torment they all expected. But there was something else. A strange calm, a controlled breathing, a presence almost unnerving. She sat on her bunk and began tearing a small scrap of cloth into threads, rolling them between her fingers, as though grounding herself in a ritual no one understood. Miriam watched her, terrified by the stillness. "What are you doing?" she whispered, but Leah only responded, "Surviving." Days later, the guards noticed another anomaly. Heinrich began requesting Leah more frequently. It was unlike him. He had always preferred variety, the unpredictable rotation of victims. But now his attention had narrowed, sharpened almost obsessively. He watched her during forced labor, lingered near her group during inspections, and once even confronted another soldier who had pushed her during a march. The soldier laughed it off, but the rest of the unit exchanged uneasy glances. Something about Adler's fixation was disturbing, even by camp standards. For the prisoners, this new dynamic brought more fear than relief. Favor from a guard was rarely a blessing. It often meant additional danger, increased scrutiny, and unpredictable punishment. Leah knew this well, but instead of shrinking, she moved with greater purpose. She paid attention to where the guards stored ration supplies, who smoked after curfew, which officers argued behind closed doors about the Red Army's advance. Each detail mattered. Each detail brought her closer to what she had begun to conceive, not a revolt, but a single decisive act. Her growing focus culminated in the moment that changed everything. One icy evening, as prisoners shoveled snow near the crematorium, Leah overheard a drunken argument between Heinrich and another SS officer. The officer mocked him, saying he was losing control of his chosen toy. Heinrich reacted with uncharacteristic fury, grabbing the man by the collar and shoving him against the wall. Although guards brawling was not unheard of, this scene carried a different energy: desperation, humiliation, and something darker that neither man named. Leah watched from the corner of her eye, her heartbeat steady, her face expressionless. She understood now. Heinrich's growing volatility was both a danger and an opportunity. His pride made him careless, his obsession made him predictable, and his authority, though feared, was beginning to crumble under the pressures of a collapsing Reich. That night, as she returned to the barrack, Miriam grabbed her arm, trembling. "Whatever you're thinking, you must stop. No one wins here. No one." Leah's voice came out quiet, almost weightless. "I am not trying to win. I'm trying to end something." Those words spread among the women like the ghost of a rumor, neither fully believed nor dismissed. What could she possibly end in a place designed to crush even the memory of defiance? But in the heart of Auschwitz, where hope was forbidden and survival reduced to numbers, the smallest disturbance was enough to shift the air. And Leah Weiss had become exactly that: a disturbance, growing, silent, dangerous. And soon it would no longer be the prisoners who feared the night. The last weeks of January 1945 were unlike any others. The front was collapsing, and the distant thunder of artillery reached even the inner blocks of Auschwitz. Guards whispered of the Red Army advancing, of cities falling, of orders to evacuate the camp and erase the evidence. The once precise machinery of death now trembled in chaos, but inside that chaos, a different kind of tension was brewing. One not born of fear, but of quiet preparation. Leah Weiss had stopped counting the days. Time no longer meant anything inside the wire. The snow had turned grey from the ashes that fell daily from the crematoria, and the air stung with the sour smell of burned lime and cold iron. But on that night, something in the rhythm of the camp broke, a silence that wasn't ordinary, a stillness that felt like the world was holding its breath. Heinrich Adler stumbled through the darkness, his flashlight cutting narrow beams through the falling snow. He was drunk again, perhaps more than usual, but the intoxication wasn't joy, it was desperation. He had received word earlier that morning that his unit would soon be withdrawn to Krakow, that the prisoners would be liquidated. To him, the idea of losing control over this small kingdom of terror was unbearable. Inside his quarters, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the faint odor of disinfectant. His medals hung slightly crooked on the wall, reflecting the trembling light of the oil lamp. Leah was already there, waiting. She had been summoned an hour earlier, but this time she didn't lower her head when he entered. He looked at her and laughed. "Even now," he said, "you think you have dignity. You think the world will care what happens to you here?" He poured himself another glass of schnapps, his hand shaking slightly. "There's nothing left outside these fences. Nothing. Only this." Leah didn't respond. Her eyes followed his movements, how he left his pistol carelessly on the desk, how his boots slipped slightly on the wet floorboards, how the keyring on his belt jingled when he turned. Her heart was steady, not from courage, but from a clarity that only those who had already lost everything could know. Heinrich sat, gesturing for her to come closer. For a moment, there was only the sound of snow tapping against the window. He leaned forward to speak, his words thick with drink. "When this place burns, when the Russians come, they'll find nothing. Not you, not me, just ashes." And then, the moment she had been waiting for, the smallest lapse of attention. He reached for his glass, his eyes off her for a heartbeat. In that single instant, the tension of months crystallized into action. She moved not with rage, but with the precision of someone enacting a final decision already made long ago. The struggle lasted seconds, chaotic, breathless, violent in its silence. The lamp fell to the ground, shattering, spilling oil that caught fire on the wooden floor. His scream pierced the walls, followed by the crash of a chair, the thud of boots, and the sound of glass breaking. When the guards arrived, drawn by the noise, they found a scene that defied comprehension. The officer collapsed in a pool of blood, writhing, half-conscious, the room burning around him, and no sign of the prisoner. The flames had begun to climb the walls, devouring papers, uniforms, and photographs. It was as if the camp itself had decided to erase what had happened there. The guards panicked, dragging Heinrich out as the roof began to smoke. He was alive, barely, his face contorted in agony. He shouted incoherent orders, demanding the search for the woman. But the snowstorm had already begun to swallow all traces. The footprints outside blurred within minutes, the wind covering them with a thin layer of ash and frost. Rumors spread before dawn. Some said Leah had escaped through a maintenance tunnel. Others claimed she had been shot near the crematorium. Her body burned with the next group of victims. But those who had known her, those who had seen that strange calm in her eyes, whispered something different. They said she was never found because she didn't run, that she stayed somewhere inside the camp, hidden, watching it burn from within. Heinrich was taken to the infirmary, his uniform soaked in blood. The doctors said he would live, but he would never be the same. The men who carried him avoided his eyes. In a world ruled by cruelty, his suffering was seen not as tragedy, but as humiliation. Within hours, the SS command had silenced the event entirely. Officially, it never happened. The records for that night disappeared. The guard logs were rewritten. Leah Weiss ceased to exist on paper, yet stories have a way of surviving even when bodies do not. Among the few women who lived long enough to see liberation, there were whispers carried in secret, of a nurse from Krakow who turned her fear into a weapon, of a night when one of the most feared men in the camp screamed like the very victims he once commanded. Years later, after the war, Allied interrogators reviewing fragments of destroyed SS files stumbled upon an odd omission, an officer listed as wounded in non-combat circumstances at Auschwitz, with no further explanation. The name was Heinrich Adler. His post-war testimony was never recorded. Some claimed he vanished during the chaos of evacuation. Others believed he took his own life before capture. But the story that endured was not his. It was hers, told in whispers, in survivor testimonies half erased by time, in the unspoken glances of those who remembered the night the predator bled and the camp's silence cracked open for the first time. In the end, the true horror of Auschwitz was not just what men like Adler did. It was how the world allowed it, how silence and order became accomplices. And in that silence, a single act of defiance became an echo that refused to die. The fire that night consumed more than the wooden walls of Heinrich Adler's quarters. It devoured traces, evidence, and the thin barrier between official record and unspoken truth. By dawn, the flames had been extinguished, the smoke rising like a final confession to the frozen sky. Yet in Auschwitz, nothing was ever truly extinguished. Everything left a residue, in the walls, in the air, in the souls of those who survived long enough to remember. The next morning, the camp functioned as if nothing had happened. Orders resumed, whistles blew, prisoners marched in formation, shuffling through snow still stained with soot. But beneath the rhythm of command, a strange unease spread through the ranks of guards. They avoided speaking of the incident directly, referring to it only as the accident. The medical unit reported that Adler had suffered a personal injury due to intoxication. His name disappeared from the active duty list within 48 hours. No formal investigation followed. In a place built on death, one wounded officer was not worth a report. Rumor, however, proved impossible to suppress. Among the prisoners, the story traveled like smoke under doors. They spoke in whispers during roll call, exchanged glances filled with a mixture of fear and awe. Some believed Leah had escaped, hiding in the chaos of the evacuations that had already begun. Others insisted she had been executed that same night. But what made the story powerful was not whether she lived or died, it was that she had acted. In a world where survival itself demanded obedience, her defiance was incomprehensible, almost mythic. The following week, the SS command began burning documents, closing archives, and preparing what they called the evacuation. Files were reduced to ash, names vanished from registries. By the time Soviet forces reached Auschwitz, the paper trail of what had occurred there, and of the people involved, was already erased. Heinrich Adler's records ended abruptly on January 20, 1945, under a classification stamped Vertraulich, confidential. No one ever saw him again. Years later, during post-war interrogations, several SS survivors mentioned an officer named Adler who had been transferred from Auschwitz shortly before the camp's liberation, gravely wounded and unfit for service. Some claimed he fled to South America under a false identity, like many others. Others whispered he died in a sanatorium near Linz, babbling about the woman with the eyes of winter. None of these claims were ever verified. As for Leah Weiss, history offered only fragments, a missing record here, a half-erased name in a transport list there. One Soviet report mentioned a Jewish nurse presumed deceased whose belongings were found in Block 22. Inside a small cloth pouch was a photograph, water-damaged and folded many times. It showed two sisters smiling on a Krakow street in 1938. On the back, a single line was still legible: "For when the world remembers again." That was all. The rest lived only in whispers, in the fragile testimonies of those who survived long enough to speak decades later. In one interview recorded in the early 1960s, an elderly woman from the women's camp recalled hearing the screams that night. Her voice trembled as she described it. It wasn't the sound of victory. It was something deeper. It was the sound of the world turning upside down for a few seconds, and then going silent again. The silence became its own kind of weapon. The Nazis perfected it, through destroyed documents, rewritten reports, and the bureaucratic erasure of every trace that did not fit the narrative of order and obedience. But silence also protected the prisoners who survived. Some never spoke because the memories were too unbearable. Others feared no one would believe them. Between these two silences, the truth hovered, invisible, undeniable. In post-war Germany, when the trials began, The name Heinrich Adler appeared once in an incomplete witness statement from a former SS officer. The name was crossed out in pencil, replaced with a note, "Identity uncertain." The file ended there. But for historians and survivors who later pieced together the fragments, the case of Leah Weiss became a forbidden symbol, the story that circulated quietly in survivor circles, never printed in official accounts, never mentioned in textbooks. A tale passed through trembling hands, half legend, half memory, entirely human. What remained was not the act itself, but what it represented, the fragile boundary between submission and defiance, between victim and executioner. In a place where evil had become routine, even one moment of rebellion carried the weight of redemption. And yet the Reich had succeeded in one last cruelty, burying that act beneath a mountain of silence. The snow continued to fall over the ruins of Auschwitz long after liberation. It covered everything evenly: the barbed wire, the watchtowers, the ash. Visitors decades later would walk through those same fields, feeling the quiet press against their chests, not knowing that beneath their feet, somewhere in the frozen earth, lay the unmarked remnants of countless forgotten stories. Among them, perhaps, the final traces of Leah Weiss, the woman who dared to disturb the order of hell and vanished into the white silence that followed. The wind that sweeps across Auschwitz today carries no voices, only the faint hum of history, too heavy to vanish, too fragile to remain. The barbed wire has rusted, the chimneys are cold, and the watchtowers stand like blind sentinels guarding nothing but ghosts. Yet in the stillness one can almost feel it, the echo of a scream swallowed by snow, the trace of a heartbeat that refused to die. When survivors later tried to describe the war, many said the same thing, that the world divided itself into two kinds of people, those who acted and those who looked away. Leah Weiss belonged to the first kind, though history never gave her a page, a monument, or even a grave. Her defiance was erased before it could be written, buried beneath the official reports of men who called their crimes orders. But memory is stubborn. It survives not on paper, but in whispers, in the quiet defiance of those who choose to remember. Somewhere in the Soviet archives lies a note, unsigned, undated, that mentions an unidentified female prisoner who inflicted injury on an SS officer during the final days of the camp. No details, no photograph, just that sentence. For historians, it is nothing. For those who know the story, it is everything. Leah's act was not born of hatred, but of something far more human, the refusal to remain invisible. In a world that reduced her to a number, she forced her oppressor to remember her as a person, even if for one moment. Her resistance was not a victory in the traditional sense. It did not save lives, change the course of the war, or rewrite the map of Europe. But it shattered the illusion of absolute control, and that alone made it powerful. Decades after liberation, when the ruins became a museum, the silence returned, orderly, respectful, distant. Visitors walked past the barracks, past the mounds of hair, the piles of shoes, the ashes sealed in glass. Few knew the story of the man whose name had been erased from the SS lists, or the woman who had dared to confront him in the heart of the camp. But sometimes, a guide would pause near Block 22 and say quietly, "Here, there was a fire once." And that was enough. Because stories like this one do not need monuments. They survive through memory, through the act of telling and retelling, of refusing to let the silence win. The past does not disappear. It only waits for someone brave enough to listen. And so, if you are hearing this now, if you followed every word, every image, every shadow of this forbidden story, then you have already become part of its preservation. What was meant to be buried has been remembered again, if only for a few minutes. This is not just about Leah Weiss or Heinrich Adler or Auschwitz. It is about the countless faces lost to the smoke, the voices that were silenced, the names erased, the courage that no one recorded. These are the stories the war tried to destroy, and they will continue to return one by one until the last silence is broken. This was only one among thousands of untold stories of World War II. If you want to uncover other forgotten truths, subscribe to the channel, leave your comment and share this story so that it will never be erased again.